One day, while typing away on my computer, I got a call from my sister Anna in the middle of the workday. This was unusual because we weren't particularly close and usually only talk a few times a year. From the second I picked up, I knew something was wrong. "Adelia?" she asked, sounding stressed. "Yes," I answered. "What's going on?" "It's our Uncle Jim. He fell again." I sighed. My Uncle Jim and I were very close when I was growing up. He stepped in to help my mom with Anna and I after our father died, and was the only father figure I knew. Until last year, he was very healthy. At least for a 70-something man who'd smoked since he was 14. About a year ago, he fell off a ladder one day while painting his living room, and his mobility never fully recovered. He'd fallen earlier in the month and sprained his wrist. He also had his electric shut off a few months back due to forgetting the bill. He seemed to be losing his self-sufficiency bit by bit. "I know you don't want to hear this, but I think it's time we started looking at nursing homes for him," Anna said. I shook my head. "No, we can't do that to him. He doesn't want to leave Rex in some dog shelter, and he loves his gardening. He would also hate being stuck in some room all day." "Adelia, he wouldn't be stuck in a room all day. They have activities. He could make friends there." "No, we'll figure something else out." I cut her off, determined to make her see my point. "I care about him too, and I'm not happy about this either," responded Anna. "But I'm scared that if we don't do something soon, he's gonna end up seriously hurt or worse." "What about hiring a home health aide?" asked. "I've already looked into that. Pickings are slim around here on his budget, and so far I haven't been able to find anyone." "I'll do it," I volunteered without thinking. "What?" asked Anna, sounding surprised. "I'll move back and be his caretaker. My job's remote and I can clean out the extra room at his house to stay in." "Are you sure?" she asked. "I know you've been doing really well in Louisville." "I love it here," I admitted, "but I want to help Jim. It's the right thing to do. He was always there for us when no one else was." "I mean, that's great, but aren't you worried about living in the same town as Chase?" she asked. I sighed. The protection order's still in effect, and Jim has plenty of guns and a big dog. "Think I'll be okay." "Well, I gotta get off the phone, but if you're serious about this, I can talk to Jim." "I am," I responded. After ending the call, I sat there in shock. I knew I wanted to be there for Jim, but I couldn't believe I was moving back to the small West Virginia town I had to flee just 4 years ago. Spent the next 2 weeks packing my things and tying up the loose ends of my brief stint in the city. I knew I would miss it. While a lot of my friends craved the wide open spaces, farmland, and light traffic of smaller towns, I felt nothing but dread the second I left city limits. I'd enjoyed growing up in the small town, but as I got older, the facade of it being a safe and quiet place began to disappear. Things seemed to get really bad when a local factory closed, leaving many people out of a job. Drug use was also rampant in the area, and an increase in theft and property crimes followed. Small businesses closed due to the lack of income, and it was generally accepted that anyone who didn't move away would likely spend their lives in poverty. The lack of employment wasn't the only reason I left. I was a freshman in high school when I met Chase, who was a senior. Quickly fell for him and moved in with him immediately after graduation. Although he'd been controlling throughout our relationship, I never knew he was capable of violence, until his first outburst a few months into us living together. I left a year later. Unfortunately, Chase didn't take the breakup well, and immediately began stalking me. I would often notice his car driving past my home and place of employment. He also wrote me unhinged letters accompanied by flowers, sometimes alive, sometimes dead. I went to local police several times for help, and was basically laughed off or told this was just a relationship issue that I needed to work out. Chase had a cousin in the police force, which likely didn't help my case. Had few ties to the small town, especially after my mom passed, and decided the most rational option would be to leave. I arrived at Uncle Jim's just a few days after the call from Anna. Anna and her husband stayed for a few hours to help me get settled in. Jim seemed really glad to have me around. As much as I hated to admit it, I could see why Anna was thinking about a nursing home. Jim would insist on doing everything himself, and within the first week there were a few false scares and forgotten pots on the stove. Eventually, he started to feel more comfortable with me helping around the house, and seemed to enjoy having more time to just sitting on the porch with Rex. Even though I missed the city, I began to feel somewhat more comfortable at Jim's. I still felt a tad uneasy when I went into town, though, because Chase still lived locally. More than anything, I found myself getting bored. I didn't have any real friends here, and there wasn't much to do. One evening, found myself taking the drive after Jim went to bed. I just needed to get out of the house for a while. Stayed away from town and was listening to music with my windows down on the back roads. I was actually having a pretty good time, till I noticed a truck behind me. Didn't think much of it at first, but they seemed to be gaining on me despite the fact that I was driving well over the speed limit. There weren't any other cars, so I figured they would pass me. They didn't. I glanced up at the rear view mirror and quickly looked back down. The driver was a male around my age. I couldn't see him that well, but he did look a lot like Chase. It was hard to say for certain since I hadn't seen him in years. The truck continued to aggressively follow me. I began panicking, fear welling up into my chest. Reached into my purse for my phone. Damn it. It wasn't there. I remembered putting it on the charger, and I must have forgotten to take it off. Could feel myself start to hyperventilate, but I knew I had to stay in control. Abruptly and without thinking, I took a sharp right turn onto a single-lane dirt road. Despite it being dark, I turned off my headlights and sped forward. Took a few random turns, one left, one right, then another left. Luckily, I didn't see any sign of the truck once I turned off. I began to wonder if I overreacted. Maybe it wasn't Chase after all. Either way, the driver still seemed questionable. Why tailgate someone for so many miles out in the middle of nowhere when you could easily pass? Quickly realized that I didn't know where I was. Great. Now I was lost at night with no phone. I tried my best to navigate my way home, but nothing was looking familiar. Just as I was losing hope, I saw a light ahead. Couldn't believe what I was seeing. The familiar bright red sign of Target. But how? I glanced around and didn't see anything nearby. No other stores, homes, or businesses. I knew from experience that Target stores are never in small towns. Certainly not on the outskirts of a small, impoverished town in West Virginia. I slowly pulled into the parking lot. I didn't see any other cars there. It was pretty late, so maybe they were closed. I decided to walk up and see. I missed shopping at Target while living in Louisville, and it would be nice to be able to get some things to make my room and office at Jim's feel more like home. To my surprise, the store was open. The glass doors opened as I approached. I grabbed a cart, excited to start shopping. I started in the cosmetics aisle, grabbing a few facial creams. I quickly noticed something unusual. There seemed to be no one else in the store. I didn't see any customers or employees. I figured maybe they were just short-staffed and not busy this time of night. I also noticed there was no music playing overhead. The only sound I could hear was the light buzzing of the fluorescent lights. Continued to walk through the aisles and made my way to home decor. I saw a cute storage ottoman that would be a great fit for my room. When I picked up the box, I noticed it was covered in a thick layer of dust. I coughed. I glanced around and noticed a few items similarly covered. I continued with my shopping, albeit slightly annoyed at the dust. I was looking at some containers on a lower shelf when I noticed black shoe prints on the ground. This place wasn't very clean for a Target, but I shrugged it off. I would need to get used to things being different here. Remembered that Jim had mentioned needing some more ibuprofen, so I decided to take a look at the medical aisle. I was grabbing a box of ibuprofen when I noticed a row of nebulizers. While I wasn't surprised to see this in the medical aisle, I was shocked at how many types they had and how much of the shelving they took up. The first few rows consisted of ones I'd seen before when my mom was in the hospital. But as I glanced down, I noticed more unusual-looking medical devices. They looked vaguely familiar, like maybe I'd seen them before in an antique store. Some looked brand new while others were rusted and covered in dust. I also noticed a bunch of oxygen tanks further down the aisle. Like the nebulizers, some looked brand new while others looked like they were decades old and worn. Nothing in here made sense. Why would a Target have all of these oxygen tanks and vintage medical supplies? Was it even safe to store the oxygen like this? Paused and picked one of the older-looking breathing machines up. As I tilted it, a black liquid spilled out. I dropped it and wiped my hand on my pants, cussing to myself. I started getting a bad feeling. I was in a strangely placed Target on the outskirts of my hometown that appeared to have no one else in it, but did stock strange items that don't belong in Target. I started to wonder if maybe the store was abandoned. I contemplated abandoning my cart and leaving the store, but as dumb as it sounds, I hadn't been able to buy anything special for myself in a long time, and I was really hoping to get what I came in for. I made my way up to the front and noticed there were no self-checkouts. I glanced around looking for an open checkout. The lights on each line were off, and I didn't see any workers. "Hello," I called out hesitantly. There was no response. I was starting to walk back towards the doors when I noticed a worker. His back was turned, but I recognized the red shirt. "Hey," I called out. He didn't answer and continued walking away. Feeling frustrated, I decided to head home. As I tried to leave, the glass doors stood still. I tried pulling them apart, but they wouldn't budge. My heart began to pound. I felt trapped, like a caged animal. I was stuck, alone in this weird store that defied all common sense. Out of the corner of my eye, noticed a clock. It was 10 p.m. on the dot. I started to reason with myself. Yes, the store's a little off compared to the Targets where I was from, but the doors are probably only locked because they close at 10, and maybe the employee was just wearing AirPods or had hearing issues. I started walking back through the store and saw the employee. His back was turned again, and he was walking ahead of me. Continued to try to call out to him with no response. Finally, I got close enough and tapped him on the shoulder. He turned his head to reveal a blank canvas of skin with no facial features present. This person, or whatever it was, has no eyes, mouth, or nose. I jumped back in horror and ran. Ran further into the store, not stopping to look back. Couldn't believe how big the store was. I'd been running for so long without hitting a wall or seeing another exit, and the store appeared to go on indefinitely. I noticed that the light was becoming dimmer and dimmer as I went forward. It was almost in the dark by the time I stopped running. The setup and merchandise of the store was becoming less and less familiar as I went further in. The aisles in the darker section of the store were filled with bags of coal, rusty-looking gas masks, and a variety of tools that looked decades old. I noticed that I was hearing faint noise, footsteps and hushed voices. I glanced around to see that there were other people in the store. At first I felt relieved, especially when I saw they had faces, unlike the employee. But then I noticed something was off. All of the people were covered head to toe in a sort of black dust. They were also dressed in clothing that looked over 50 years old. Some wore gas masks. Others didn't. Few had headlamps. I knew coal mining was a big industry in West Virginia, but nothing here looked modern. One of the men turned to look at me. His eyes widened and he began sprinting towards me, steel pick in hand. I ran but tripped and he quickly caught up to me. He was hovering over me, and I was certain the pick would soon be crashing into my skull when another man pushed him away, and I took off. At this point, I was so deep in the store that it was pitch black. I saw people walking around but tried to avoid being noticed. I saw a faint light towards the back of the store. It was a cave with people surrounding it. The entrance glowed orange like a fire was lit. I hid behind a shelf and tried to figure out what they were looking at. Someone emerged from the cave and an empty minecart followed in tow. A man walked up to it and began emptying huge bags into it, the contents of which crashed against the walls of the trolley. I could see the outline of the last few bits coming out of the bag. Bones. I stood there frozen in terrified silence watching this strange ritual play out. Little did I know, it would only get stranger. Heard loud footsteps and the floor vibrated beneath my feet. I could see a shadow from within the cave. It appeared to be hunched over, as if it was too tall to stand up straight in the cave. As the figure emerged, I could see it was humanoid in shape and stature, but had a generous display of antlers. I remembered Jim telling us kids legends about wendigos in the area. He claimed to have encountered one while hunting. I didn't believe him at the time, especially with his track record of telling tall tales, but there was nothing else that could describe what I was seeing. The wendigo let out what I can only describe as a demonic screech. It spoke in a low, distorted voice. "I need more," it yelled. The man standing next to the trolley said something in a quiet voice that I couldn't make out. The wendigo lowered its head, so it was eye level with the people standing there, and snarled, causing a few of them to jump back. It then retreated back into the cave. "What the hell?" I whispered. Just then, a hand covered my mouth. I turned around and noticed it was the same man who pushed the guy who attacked me earlier. His skin was hot to the touch, almost burning my lips. Tried to scream, but he tightened his hand around my mouth. He whispered to me, "You need to stay quiet or you're going to end up in that minecart. If you keep quiet, I'll help you get out." Apprehensive, I nodded. He took his hand off. He glanced around and motioned for me to follow him. He pulled me off into an aisle as there were a lot of people walking back from the cave. "We need to give everyone a few minutes to clear out before looking for the way out," he said. "There's a janitor's closet up front. We need to make a beeline for it and stay as quiet as possible. Got that?" I nodded. We were able to get into the closet safely. The man lit up some archaic-looking lantern, and I was able to see his face for the first time. He looked to be late 20s and was covered in soot like the others. Despite his gritty appearance, he had kind-looking eyes. "Tell me, what is this place?" I asked, stammering. The man chuckled. "It's whatever you want it to be. For some it's a bar, others a casino. Hell, I've even seen it be a strip club." I gave him a confused look. "Look, I don't have time to go into all the fairy tales and lore behind this place, but it's basically the perfect storm of cryptids and angry human spirits," he explained. "West Virginia hasn't treated its people so well for a long time, and hasn't treated the environment much better. When you have hundreds of people dying an early and ugly death because of unsafe working conditions, their spirits tend to stick around. The cryptids weren't happy with their land being invaded either, so we teamed up, and here we are. The cryptids require so many human sacrifices each year in order to maintain their alliance with the human spirits. The human spirits are happy to pitch in because most here are full of rage and want revenge on the people living now for enjoying the fruits of their labor." I stated at him, "My name's Andy, but the way," he said casually. "So this place is like a live trap for humans?" I asked. Andy nodded. "Pretty much. People who happen to pass by see something that would draw them in, like moths to a porch light. I felt embarrassed. I fell for thinking a target would be in the middle of nowhere. "Were you a coal miner?" I asked, trying to wrap my head around this. Andy nodded. "Yeah. I died way before you were ever born." "Was it a collapse?" I asked. "No, it was lung complication," he responded. "Wait, so if all the human spirits here are angry and need sacrifices, why are you helping me?" I asked. Andy shrugged. "It all starting to lose its luster for me. Don't get me wrong, I'm angry I died so young, especially because my daughter wasn't even 2 yet. But making other people suffer a worse fate isn't gonna change how my life turned out. When it's just drunken assholes walking in here hoping to cheat on their wife, I don't feel so bad, but you look like you have your whole life ahead of you." Andy and I talked for a while, waiting for the others to clear out. Andy told me that once daylight hits, the target will disappear. If I'm not on the outside, I'll be stuck, hiding in here until I'm caught and sacrificed. At some point in the night, I heard a distant scream. It was definitely a human being killed. I could tell Andy tried his best to act like he didn't hear it and to distract me, but I knew what I heard. About an hour after we got to the closet, Andy opened the door and looked around. "It looks like the coast is clear," he said, smiling. "But where's the way out?" "The door was locked. You have to go out the same way you came in. The laws of reality still apply to the door you entered through. So if it was locked, we need to break it or pry it open." "Okay," I answered hesitantly. Andy and I carefully began making our way to the front of the store. Andy grabbed a crowbar off a nearby shelf. Once we were up front, he began prying the door open. The sound of a security system blared the second it opened. Before I could leave the store, someone grabbed me from behind. It was one of the many human spirits. They all came running when they heard the security system. They began to surround me. The one who grabbed me, a large, gruff-looking man wearing overalls and covered in soot, began to strangle me. I tried to fight myself free, but it was no use. I felt the breath leaving my lungs and began to feel dizzy. Just as I was accepting my fate, a familiar face emerged from the crowd. Andy hit the man holding me in the face with the crowbar, bloodying his mouth, then yanked me towards the door. The others attempted to grab me and Andy. One tried to grab my arm, and I clawed and bit him until he let go. As Andy and I got closer to the slightly opened door, the spirits began pushing us up against the glass. It felt like I was being crushed. Andy managed to make enough room to move me closer to the door. The crowbar had fallen during the struggle, and I couldn't reach it. I was going to be crushed if I didn't get this door open. I pulled at it for what felt like forever, my fingernails breaking off and bleeding in the process. Then it finally opened enough for me to skip out, and I ran out. Turned back to see the others were angrily turning on Andy. "Adelia, take this and give it to my daughter," he yelled and tossed a worn envelope out the door. Inched back towards him. "I'm gonna help you, Andy," I said. "No," he screamed. "Just make sure my daughter gets the envelope." I hesitated, then grabbed it and ran to my car. Peeled out of there and was quickly back on the road. I was shaking and hyperventilating the entire drive. It was daybreak by the time I made my way home. Still in the driveway, I looked at the envelope. It was heavy. The outside had a name. The ink was so faded I could barely see it. "Josie Reyes," I read. On the inside there was an old-looking watch. I looked it over for a few minutes. Just then there was a tap on my window. I jumped. It was Jim. "Good God, Jim, you scared me," I gasped as I got out of the car. He looked concerned. "Where were you? You look like hell." Shook my head. "It's a long story. I went shopping, but I got lost." "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. I saw something, that's for sure." Jim gave me a knowing look. "You know, I've seen a lot living here all these years. I was kinda glad when you moved away. thinking maybe you'd be spared some of the strangeness that comes along with living here. But there's more good here than bad. There's so many good people around here that would literally give you the shirt off their back. I guess what I'm trying to say is when a beautiful landscape and caring, hard-working people are exploited year after year, things start getting weird. The politicians who line their pockets may not be keeping score, but Mother Nature is supernatural forces too. I nodded. Jim, do you know someone named Josie Race? Asked. Yeah, she plays poker here every Saturday, he responded, looking curious. I have something I need you to give her. Told him. At the point when I was around 11 years of age, my entire family was welcomed to my home for Thanksgiving. My mother welcomed basically her entire family. My sister and her 2 girls came, my auntie, and I think my grandparents visited also. This was a long time back, so I can't exactly recollect who everything was there. I guess the main individual in this story, however, is my auntie. Her child died when I was only a child. I've been told it was pretty awful. On a highway, he was in an accident. As he was escaping his vehicle, an alcoholic driver hit him and killed him. I don't think I at any point had the opportunity to meet him. Yet, regardless of whether I wouldn't recall. However, I have lots of photographs of him. My family probably stayed through the Thanksgiving holiday and into the weekend. Except it was the second evening of my family remaining that my very first paranormal experience occurred. My room was down the lobby from the visitor room, specifically at opposite ends of the hallway. The main individuals in there were my sister and her girls. Everyone else was sleeping either in my mother's room or in the living room. We didn't have an exceptionally huge house. My room was about halfway down the hall from the bathroom. When I first awoke, I had to use the bathroom. I didn't have any idea what time it was. Nevertheless, it was most likely around 4 a.m. It was a very early morning. I regularly turned every one of the lights on to go to the washroom, yet my sister left her entryway open, and I didn't need the lobby light to wake them, so I just did without the light. Ordinarily, I would have been unnerved in light of the fact that I detested the dull. However, I felt okay realizing my older sibling was close by. When I tried to open the bathroom door, it slammed shut like someone had pushed it back, maybe an inch or 2. I was extremely befuddled, so I attempted once more. This time the entryway didn't move by any means. Once more, I attempted and put my shoulder to the entryway and pushed energetically. Again, it appeared as though someone was pushing back, but because I was pushing harder, the door remained open for about 5 to 6 inches and was kind of moving back and forth. I don't truly know how to make sense of it. I've depicted it before as playing a game as a youngster with a companion, attempting to push an entryway open or shut while your companion was on the opposite side pushing back. After perhaps 10 seconds of pushing the entryway, it at long last gave. When it opened, it struck the wall behind it. Staggered, however, didn't fall. I looked forward into the bathroom after I had stabilized myself. What I saw was strange, but surprisingly, it didn't scare me. I saw a tall figure. Could make out a head and shoulders right at the roof then. At that point, the rest only sort of streamed into very nearly address the whole way to the floor. It was white and sparkling. I was unable to see any facial highlights or any such thing, simply the shape, white and gleaming. Gazed at it briefly or thereabouts. Then, at that point, I essentially turned the light on. It disappeared, and I continued on ahead and utilized the bathroom. 2 years ago, I just left that house. Prior to that day, and consistently later, the entryway never adhered or was difficult to push open like it was that evening. Another weird thing is obviously my family took lots of photographs during the visit. At the point when we glanced back at them, there were circles. However, just around myself, my sister, her children, and my auntie. I have taken 1,000,000 photographs in that house. It was fresh out of the plastic new when we moved in. The main time circles showed up was this one time with my family there. I recollect one of my auntie dozing, and there were a lot of circles on her. She was covered, like my cousin was holding her. We as a whole believe right up to the present day, it was him. The injury / spirit / heavenly messenger, anything you desire to call it, that I saw, was positive. We simply all have an inclination it was him. We don't have the foggiest idea why. Perhaps we are simply confident. Perhaps I was extremely drowsy and dreaming. However, it felt genuine. For the last, perpetually, my mom and I have been going to my uncle's home in country Missouri for Thanksgiving. It's about an hour away from where we live, and my grandparents used to go there as well. My uncle and I share a common feeling about individuals, so he fabricated his home on a rock street that fell off a region parkway on 8 sections of land of no one in sight. Unblemished magnificence, and I love it. It was his ultimate haven, surrounded by forest and a meandering stream behind the house, where he caught worms and grubs for fishing, and I would find turtles. You could see fundamentally every star in presence around evening time, since there was no light contamination, and we could go around as children without any feeling of dread toward criminals or getting hit by a vehicle. Which is the reason, when I was 10 and some irregular dickus fabricated a monster moronic house straightforwardly across the road from my uncle and auntie, the outcome was a negative energy in my uncle's butthole cake-wrap. To say he was pissed would be putting it mildly. And the person across the road, Gerald, was a Goliath douche. His home was huge, and he was continuously parading his new vehicle, his up-and-coming sweetheart, something. And afterward he began, and on Thanksgiving, consistently since I was 12, he would come walking over to my uncle's home, thump on the entryway just before lunch and welcome himself in. My auntie is altogether more prudent than my uncle, who just at any point addressed Gerald in terse 1 or 2 word reactions. Then Gerald would raise, circumventing the table and getting out whatever we were grateful for, basically so he could gloat about how well he was doing. Got 2 new snowmobiles this year so I can take this model I'm dating out and show her what a genuine Midwest snowfall is. Or on the other hand, just figured out my ledger has fundamentally significantly increased over the most recent 3 months, so I can, without much of a stretch, bear the cost of a gold-plated Shark Tank, or no big deal either way. In addition to the fact that he was a showboater, yet he'd likewise shamed Jim with the way that he had far beyond they did. Even though he may have been a dickhead, I believe my aunt felt sorry for him because the man had no family, and he just always did this, which was awful in Jesus' name. So half a month prior, as we heaped my family into the minivan to head to my auntie and uncle's, my significant other and I kidded about what gibberish Gerald would have this year. As she fastened her belt, she sneered, "Maybe he has a dinosaur." I checked the children's car seats and got in. Nah, he's likely got a goddamn dinosaur amusement park arranged out. My significant other laughed, and we drove, and we showed up. After greeting my aunt and uncle with hugs, the children dashed inside and down to the creek bed. "Hello, folks. Assuming it begins to rain, come in. That rivulet could flood speedy," I yelled after them. The conjecture hadn't called for downpour. However, it had gotten extremely dull and shady rapidly after we'd left the highway, so I would have rather not taken any risks. Smiled and inquired if my uncle had heard from Gerald today after my uncle slapped my back and gave me a hug. He laughed and said, "Sha, don't say his name too loud or he'll show up early." As a matter of fact, his face sort of scrunched up, thinking, he's been covering his windows and pressing his vehicle earlier today. He let Darcy know that he was going on an outing, so we probably won't see him by any means. We went into the living room to have a drink and talk because I couldn't complain. Around early afternoon, when we'd seen nor heard from Gerald, my auntie came in and shrugged, welcoming us to the table for supper. We plumped down, did the standard grateful for clear discourse, and right as my uncle cut up the turkey, there was a thump on the entryway. It makes perfect sense to while. My child yelled and hurried to the entryway, with me close by. Anticipated Gerald, however, there was a youthful person in a white shirt, dark pants, dark glasses, no coat, and a clipboard. You should be. He squinted down at his clipboard. Jerry. I am here to inform you that the contract expires today, November 23, 2017. So if you'll come along with me, we can, I said. Apologies, I'm not Gerald, I am Mike, yet Gary lives across the road. I looked past the youngster and into the carport, didn't see a vehicle, so I don't know how he arrived or where he anticipated that Gerald should go with him. Yet it didn't appear to issue, in light of the fact that the youngster plainly didn't trust me. Sir, I can guarantee you that I was informed this generally occurs, and that you were informed the date. You perhaps received an email about it. He pointed to my pocketed phone. I pointed across the no longer gravel, but still shitty road, and rolled my eyes. I'm not Gerald, Bud. He lives in the OLY, WHER, ONTHISSTRET. But once more he frowned and didn't even look in my direction. Sir, kindly don't make this hard for me. It's my most memorable day. Just shrugged as his face took on a pleading expression. The person you need lives across the road. Presently, if it's not too much trouble, excuse me while I eat my weight in bird with bread in its poop hole. And I shut the entryway. My son smiled at me. Try not to rehash what I just shared with your mom. He shook his head and ran back to the lounge area, and I followed, however, not prior to looking outside at the patio once more, where I saw the person on the telephone, looking sort of mad, checking the house number, and so forth. We began eating, and I saw through the breaking faith glass entryway that it had gotten considerably more unfavorable looking outside. I pondered the geeky fellow, and how he didn't have a coat on. What a nitwit. Blizzards could be somewhat horrendous around here in the colder time of year, to such an extent that I referenced to my significant other that I ought to move the vehicle from the marginally disposed carport. It was on to more even out ground. She concurred, so I headed outside, and saw the youngster was no more. Great, I said without holding back, accepting he at long last got it straight, and went to mess with Gerald. The breeze selected up as I got from the van, almost pushing the entryway shut on my lower leg, and the mist became even hazier. I ran inside, snatched my glass of wine, and put down to screw up some cranberry sauce. The initial not many tinks of something raising a ruckus around town made me turn upward. Beautiful hail. I thought, however, at that point I saw the hail was moving. I went to the window and peered down on the deck. What is it, honey? My significant other inquired. I wasn't sure, yet I muttered it's not hail, bugs. They're bugs. Also, they were countless insects hitting each window yet not splatting, and afterward amassing the ground outside. My children were justifiably gone crazy and intrigued simultaneously, and the grown-ups traded looks of stress, tempered by liquor. We kept eating, and afterward one more thump on the entryway punctured the quiet of Thanksgiving supper and the tireless drumming of creepy crawlies pouring down. I got up and the thumping developed more relentless. I pulled the entryway open, and there was the youngster once more, looking priggish yet upset, clipboard next to him. All set, Jerry? He inquired. I scoffed and shut the entryway all over. The beetle stopped when I sat down, and I could hear him sigh as he picked up the phone again. Well, that is great, I said. My children, uncle and auntie were peering through the window, however, focused on the tree line, and my better half looked stressed. "What's happening?" I inquired. Because of the way the trees were moving, I assumed that the wind had picked up significantly. To put my nose against the glass and noticed, and my auntie opened the window close to my seat. We all listened to something that was neither silence nor wind. My uncle ventured out onto the deck, keeping away from bugs as he could, and turned around to us, his face pale. "There's no wind. The trees are shaking, like shaking in the ground, vibrating." The sky developed more obscure, and as my uncle lifted his eyebrow in a shift focus over to us all, the rivulet bed where my children had been playing scarcely 2 hours before yawned open, the sound something like thunder and falling rocks. Dim shapes amassed around the 7-foot-long gap, and I got my uncle and pulled him inside. All at once, as the amassing haziness blended into ambiguously humanoid shapes and started to climb the slope to the house, the thumping at the front entryway fired up once more. "Jerry, you really want to respect the agreement. Accompany me now," the youngster yelled, sort of noisy, however, with a new tone of threat that wasn't there previously. The trees started shaking all the more fiercely, the shapes getting closer, and house loaded up with tormented murmurs. My children were shouting, crying, and my uncle, tracker he is, ran into his nuke, opened his weapons safe, and got a few for us. The thumping proceeded, and from down in the storm cellar, a sound like a demolition hammer hitting a sheet of tin fired up, adding one more degree of dread to the chaos that encompassed us. Gerld, Gerld, Gerld. I continued to hear from the front until my uncle, eye jerking, recently snapped. He stacked up his shotgun, bluntly strolled to the front entryway, opened it up, and wrecked the person, weapon pointed under his jawline. "I'm not Gerald Skinner. Gerald Skinner lives across the road at 126 Clark Street. This is 12. He pivoted to his location, where the 9 had rearranged to a 6 from a free nail. He stood up, slapped his hand on the 6, turned it around, and glanced back at the person. 129. This is 129. Poophole. What tone was left in the man's face depleted, and he mixed to get his telephone out, shackily settling on a decision, and running down the carport quickly. Perhaps 30 seconds after the fact, everything halted, the insects were gone. The trees were still, and the spring looked typical. The sky was as yet dull. However, it was nearly winter, so no big deal either way. As if we had all been holding our breath for the past 5 minutes, we all kind of exhaled simultaneously as we sat down in the living room where our legs gave out. I held my child and my better half held our little girl, and my auntie was wailing. My uncle actually looked pissed, significantly more so when after only a couple of moments' relief. There was one more thump at the entryway. When I opened it, I expected to see the nerdy guy once more, but instead I saw a nice old man in a suit that was perfectly tailored. He grinned a grin that was immense and phony, and messy but conveyed outright earnestness simultaneously. "Great day. Sorry about that awful interference to your Thanksgiving supper. Understudies, haha," he expressed, sort of elbowing my ribs tenderly. I giggled and gestured, as though I needed to manage understudies every day. We were looking for Mr. Skinner, and well, you know how it goes. Little misunderstandings, haha. He got some distance from me, and caught his hands behind his back, looking across the road at Gerald's home. "At any rate, for what reason do you need that person? He's sort of a prick," I said. The man laughed, yet his face turned out to be very difficult. Mr. Skinner signed a contract with our business on Thanksgiving Day 20 years ago. We thought, after we'd mistakenly recognized this house as his, that he was basically attempting to escape our arrangement. He tapped his foot to a cadence that I was unable to hear. He was odd, this little elderly person. And afterward he proceeded. "They quite often attempt to escape the agreement, yet none have at any point been basically as resolute as you were, and that combined with the new person, It's all been a wreck, so once more, we apologize for the bother. He kind of glanced back at us, and we as a whole mumbled something like, no problem. I looked across the road and saw Gerald madly yelling at the understudy, whose dissatisfaction I could yell as far as possible on our patio. We looked as Gerald ran inside, and the understudy settled on a telephone decision. Dull shapes sprung up in the reaped corn handles by and large around Gerald's home, moving gradually towards his yard. I could see the sides of the elderly person's mouth climb, showing a grin that I realized I presumably didn't have any desire to see. The windows and tires of Gerald's new Hummer detonated outward, and we could hear him endlessly shout. So, can we eat here? Inquired. I don't have any idea, I asked. However, it seemed like I ought to, presumably. Gracious goodness indeed, obviously, he said, signaling us away. However, the Beatles will be missed. We went inside to be thankful that our house was where it was and not in the Dali-like landscape across the road, shaking our heads in agreement. As I shut the entryway, I heard the elderly person share with himself, "Truly do cherish the scarabs." At the grocery store, don't argue over the last Thanksgiving turkey. It's not worth your day-to-day's life. I needed to stay there and watch my grandma strip back the skin on her own hand, plunge it, crude tissue uncovered, into a bowl of hot sauce, and take a chomp. Her teeth couldn't get through the fingers. Her jaw was excessively feeble. She stayed there, chomping pointlessly, while sauce and blood trickled down her jawline. She was powerless and couldn't stop herself, unfit to complete her feast, caught in the detestable activity, similar to some wrecked robot. The satanic souls impugning had deadened every one of us, and my unfortunate grandmother, 74 years of age, was quick to be compelled to play out an unbelievable demonstration of self-mutilation. Her substantial independence was in a moment taken from her, unceremoniously revoked by the same unquestionable power that had joined my parents' bodies into an unholy union of battered flesh after telekinetically brutalizing them. While sitting across from me and next to his wife, my grandfather wept as he watched her, and afterward at the snap of our abuser's fingers he turned, put his own hand on his plate, and grasped his blade with his other hand. I automatically shouted out, not having any desire to see him pitifully headed to self-hurt. He gazed toward me, a demeanor of unadulterated ghastliness all over, and I cried straightforwardly, boisterously. I told you, in the event that you utter a sound, you'll be compelled to skirt your dinner and go directly to dessert. No meat for you. The thing with two awfully combined heads, what had once been my mom and father, independently limped toward me, thumping dishes and glasses from the table. It chanced upon a seat that had been pulled out from underneath the table hours prior, my sibling's seat, and crushed it with a knob-ridden arm. My skin was pierced by the inevitable shrapnel of wood fragments that flew in the air. Just faintly felt the agony. Whatever the paralytic component was, it also had a numbing effect. The swaying ghastliness came to stand clumsily close to me, squeezed straight facing my shoulder, and I felt its body pulsate and throb convulsively. Heard its conjoined hearts thump arrhythmically, smelled the offal of its horrifyingly uncovered, heedlessly ensnared stomach-related frameworks. Blood and bile dribbled from its worn-out clothing. Might it be said that you are prepared for your treat? You deserve it, with that little explosion of yours. Venturing into the hole between my mom's collapsed bosom and my dad's destroyed pectoral, it took out a cluster of sludge, some dreadful, bile-like discharge. It respected the green stuff for a couple of seconds, my mom's eyes shimmering in the radiance of the oddly glistening goop as it lifted her hand above me. The slime was then forced into my face and dropped onto my plate with a cackle that was filled with phlegm. The smell and the little taste of it I got were both horrendous. Yet the most awful part was the vibe of the ooze all over. It consumed, not really with regards to temperature, but rather causticity. It was horrendously harsh. As I attempted to inhale, I felt it begin to consume the skin of my cheeks. Fortunately, I'd instinctually shut my eyes after landing. Otherwise, I'm certain I would have lost my sight. Right when I assumed I planned to kick the bucket, suffocated in a shallow pool of destructive ooze, the tension on the rear of my head was feeling significantly better, and I darted up standing, heaving for air. Naturally, I shook my face, frantically expecting to get the sludge off me. I possibly quit whipping my face to and fro when I heard my grandma shout in desolation. Turning, I expected to track down her chomping on her hand, feeling that she'd at last nibbled through her fingers. I'd rather found her face softening, the muscle previously offering to bone as the corrosive dealt with her old, effectively consumed skin. It just required a couple of moments for her to bite the dust. My grandfather stared, speechless from the event. I let completely go, became crazy. I cried, beseeched her to awaken, to take a gander at me, even as her softened eyeball began to trickle from the burning hot attachment. The thing left, walked back to the top of the table, where it plunked down and emulated eating. There was nothing on the plate before it. It got a fork with my mother's hand, a blade with both of my dad's. They were too powerless exclusively to be of any utilization, and cut and wounded at the non-existent dinner. Supper went on like that for basically 1 more hour, me going through periods of intense hysteria and insensate silence, my granddad gazing, the thing removing vast parts from its vacant plate. All at the point when the doorbell rang, it stood, applauded its hands together, and said, "Goodness, that should be your sibling. I'll get him." That took me back to mindfulness, back to that angering reality. My sibling had recently had his most memorable youngster. He and his life partner were so glad to have begun a family together. I realized that I was unable to allow this thing to hurt him, couldn't allow my sibling to be detracted from his prospective spouse and delightful child. Some way or another, I defeated the spell or poison of loss of motion, probably as a result of the mixture of anxiety and accumulated adrenaline. I stood, went around the table, and with the blade I'd evidently snatched en route, held onto hold of my dad and cut him in the head. The edge sank into his skull effectively, way too effectively, and a greenish-yellow pus flooded out rather than blood. The repulsiveness pivoted, and my mom's face grinned mischievously. "That one's been dead for a really long time. You were unable to tell." I was sent flying across the lounge area, into the cupboard where the extravagant plates, many currently crushed to bits, were kept beyond occasions. The effect took the breath out of me, and I arrived on the floor hard, in confounding torment. Shards of glass, the sheets from the entryways, fell onto me, and I almost had my jugular cut by an especially enormous section, groveling on the floor, with my hands behind schedule covering my neck and face. I paid attention to the frightfulness, ungraceful strides as it went to the front entryway. I heard the entryway open, and afterward my siblings' shout filled the house. Disregarding the shards of glass, I crept toward the corridor that prompted the front of the house. Heard hints of battling, and afterward my siblings shouted once more, just this time it was a lot more fragile, articulated with huge torment, and oddly suppressed. This rushed my development a bit, in spite of the fact that my ribs and shoulder throbbed excruciatingly, something without a doubt swollen or even broken. Justing the corner, I came into the corridor and saw a sight of uncommon foulness. My brother was completely consumed by the horror of his parents. My siblings' legs hung from the animal's vast chest depression. Blood splattered from my mother's prematurely placed nativity scene onto the freshly vacuumed carpet, the hall walls, and the perfectly polished table where the feet kicked helplessly. His lamentable shout was unfortunately cut off by a boisterous mash, as the jaws of the frightfulness chest depression, the distorted, mortally bended rib confine, shut firmly upon his own, quickly killing him. With a wet thud, his bisected lower half fell to the ground, blasted moronic by the sheer terribleness of his demise. I could look as his upper half was bitten and gulped by the gigantic jaws. However, the awful scene did not end there. The exposed internals of my brother's body forced me to observe its digestion. Frozen, I watched the digestion tracts and stomach enlarge as the chewed and corrosive liquefied remains flowed through the horribly amalgamated viscera of my mom and father. At long last, again gathering up some leftover self-discipline, I shut my eyes and dismissed. Wouldn't watch the last not many unwholesome snapshots of the unthinkably quick cycle. The occasions after that occurred in a fantasy-like shock, and I presently think of it as a leniency that I was saved, through my shock-prompted ridiculousness. The homicide of my granddad. Assuming he shouted or called out for my assistance. Didn't hear. Drooped against the corridor table, lying on my arms. I trusted that demise will come to me, seen with unquestionably the dimmest mindfulness the consummation of my granddad's life. Heard the apparently far away and inconceivably evil yelling and chortling of that body-taking and tissue-eating devil. The thing came back to the hallway after what seemed like minutes or hours, and I was carried up by my neck, easily. It held me up so my face was level with my dead dad's, and talking through the hanging lips in a corrupted presentation of puppetry. It said, "One should stay to bear the culpability of what this family has done. You denied me of my Thanksgiving. Thus I've denied you of yours. Live, and always remember what occurred here." Furthermore, despite the fact that I was investigating my dad's coded, unseeing eyes, I saw behind them a natural presence. A picture of somebody I'd as of late met. Affected to look further, I looked profoundly into the dead eyes, and finally saw him. Prior in the day, my mother and I were at the supermarket, and that is where we experienced the man in odd, old-fashioned clothing, with a thick, unattractive facial hair and hard, bruised eyes. The person who swore at us. Initially, I hadn't moved toward visiting, yet my father, after a long telephone discussion, during which I was paid off with homemade cheesecake, persuaded me to join in. He'd previously done likewise for my sibling, who additionally hadn't moved toward visiting. Thus, with 3 additional mouths to take care of, my sibling's child left with his life partner's folks. My mom chose to purchase a greater turkey, giving the one she previously purchased to a foundation. Earlier today, she and I went to the supermarket and figured out how to catch the last turkey they had. A tremendous bird, which they brought out from the back, where it had some way or another stayed inconspicuous for quite a long time. It was a fortunate find for us, lucky, at least for the time being. The peculiarly dressed man, who'd likewise gone briefly turkey run, offered us cash for the turkey, yet we declined, and made sense of our off-the-cuff need for it. He became irritated, said a few unrepeatable, frightfully melodious things, then, at that point, stomped off. We just accepted he was insane. Unpredictable was my mother's assertion, and obliged our day. Choking under the grasp of my mother's colossally proportioned hand, I attempted to apologize, despite the fact that I hadn't done anything morally off base. Be that as it may, the insane man who had some way or another found us and laid a revile upon us, wouldn't tune in. At the point when I thought I'd stifle to death, the second time that evening, it raised back and pummeled me against the lobby table, crushing the little puppets, and afterward passed on me to lie among the pieces. I witnessed the pathetic body collapse in a landslide of organs and flesh before I passed out from the shock and pain. What's more, as it fell to pieces, it let out a long, crazy, blackly remarkable cry. That was last Thanksgiving. Evidently, I was the sole survivor. I've recuperated from my wounds, yet haven't recuperated from the mental injury. However, it is a brand new year and Thanksgiving, and I am spending it with the child of my brother and her grandparents, my only remaining family. I have a couple of somewhat late things to snatch from the supermarket, and afterward all that will be prepared. What could turn out badly? I love the night. The buildings will remain the same as they were in daylight, and the views will not lose their beauty, but will simply be free of the obstructions of people and the pressure of crowds. My strange, bordering on manic enjoyment at night skyrocketed on days when I had nothing to wake up to. Spent every weekend living like a vampire. This meant that when summer vacation came, I was able to let my sleep pattern fall to shame, which I enjoyed. I would wake up around 9 p.m. After about 10 hours of sleep, I would watch TV, scroll through my phone, answer all the messages I had received hours earlier, then get into my parents' car and wander the dark streets of my numb mind. City. It was a system he had followed 1,000 times before. My joy came not from the sights of my city, but from the feeling of isolation and refuge in the post-midnight atmosphere. This was the only time my earthly hometown didn't bore me to the point of being a weirdo. There is not a soul inside these prisoners that have an interesting story. No one stands out or shows any potential for greatness. The fact that we have no celebrities to offer the world confirms my belief that it has always been this way. I am no exception, and neither is my family. Being boring hurts you more when there is nothing or no one around you to distract you. Perhaps finding myself on the roads in the early hours of the morning was my excuse for feeling different. As a main character, exchanged pleasant but subtle greetings with the few other cars I saw at traffic stops, and enjoyed the thrill the police cars gave me when I received a suspicious look or an accusatory gesture from passing officers. Next to me, waiting for the lights to change. Some even stopped me to ask me what I should be doing at that hour. They always encouraged me to come home, and I would pretend to listen before leaving and act like a wanted fugitive. Looking back, I wish I had heeded their warnings. It was a few weeks before the familiar small-town boredom began to creep in. I wish I could be in the lead of a horror movie. I began to love the idea of tall men in shadows waiting for me under the streetlights or sinister silhouettes staring at me from the windows of suburban houses. I just wanted excitement, something the real world could no longer offer me. I'd been filling my head with these morbid scenarios and ghostly creatures before I pulled out of the driveway, hoping it would make the trip more interesting. So when my evil human monster appeared in the form of a crying little boy dazzled by the headlights who was standing in the middle of the intersection, he was more confused and worried than terrified. Remember hearing the faint hum of the car engine as I watched him standing there. He was crying with one hand and holding a rags blanket wrapped around him with the other. Hoped it wasn't my problem, and prayed that a concerned parent would come along and get it out of the way, but I knew this was my night now. I opened my car door and her sobs became audible. "Are you okay there, little man? Are you lost?" Asked from behind the door, using it as a cover for my paranoia. My father left. "I can't find him," he cried in response. I was still looking around quickly, unsure if this was some sort of prank or carjacking tactic. "You want to jump? I can take you to the police station down the street and take you somewhere safe," reassured him as I tried to do the same to myself. The boy slowly raised his arm and reached for me as he headed toward my car. He was a few feet away from me when I started to think about raising my arms to meet him, but before I could read the situation further, the boy's face began flashing blue and red from the approaching lights behind me. The angry roar of a speeding car got closer before the screaming stopped. I turned around and saw two officers jumping out from either side of the police car and pointing their weapons at me. "Stay away from the child and don't even think about touching him." I raised my hands out of fear. "I didn't do anything. I found him here in a second," she started hysterically. An officer walked around the front of the car so he could see his face. His gun was still pointed at me. I watched him take the midnight air into his lungs, ready to scream again, but the aggression in his expression broke and was replaced by a strange look of pain and remorse. She looked at him in confusion as he struggled to spit out his words yet. Completely, a look of pure hatred and malice flooded his face. "Now!" shouted the officer. I quickly jumped into the driver's seat and fled the scene. As I was driving away, I noticed in the rearview mirror that the officer's guns were not pointed at me, but at the child. The bright lights faded in the distance, and I once again found myself alone in the dark of the night. The loneliness and refuge I once felt have completely diminished. What the hell just happened? This was the first time he listened to the police encouraging him to return home. I remember walking back to the driveway and feeling no more understanding in my mind than I did when I left the boy and the officers at that intersection. I felt an emptiness of emotion where fear should have been. I knew my confusion should have led to support from family, friends, or even the internet. But all I wanted to do was follow the same old routine and investigate the night again. I spent the rest of the early morning hours checking my phone and watching TV like I usually do, but my brain wasn't responding to my friends' messages or watching late-night comedies. I knew where I would be at this time tomorrow, and nothing could dissuade me from those plans. It was a system he had followed 1,000 times before. Such a small period of time took years. I knew I wasn't getting my usual 10 hours of sleep, but it was enough to keep me prepared for the clouds I was about to remove from my consciousness. I realized what I was doing several times as I waited, my head jumping between the clarity of being the young adult preparing to chase a child in the dark, and the excitement I had been craving all those dark nights behind the wheel. I thought about my lack of planning as I jumped back into the driver's seat. All I can really do is go back to the intersection and plan from there. Thought about the boy's angry look from the night before as I headed in the same direction. I played out possible scenarios in my head on a continuous loop, as one does while preparing for a workplace confrontation. They filled every corner of my mind as I felt the car shake on the hard road. I was minutes away from the crossing, and when my true self became clear enough to feel the buzz of anxiety in my stomach, my rendezvous with the unknown progressed. The same rough blanket wrapped around them, the same desperate moans, the same look of lost panic, but a different face. This time, standing on the side of the road was a young girl. I felt my seatbelt tighten as I hit the brakes and stopped on the empty road. I saw the girl looking at me as I opened the car door. I closed it behind me as I approached her. This time I had nothing to protect me. I stopped a few feet away from her and waited for her to start the conversation. Something was wrong. "My mother is gone. I can't find him." His tone was similar to the boy's. "What is your name?" she whispered coldly. "My mother is gone. I can't find him," I repeated. I crouched down, keeping my distance from her but now at eye level with the girl. "Where did you lose it? Why were you out now?" She remained silent. I looked at her for a few seconds as she continued to cry. I was thinking of something else to say when he raised his arm to reach me, opening his hand and his fingers motioning for me to hold it. I looked towards my car. I felt an intense need to bridge the distance between us and help her, but something wasn't right about her appearance. Something about his eyes. Sadness covered his face, but his gaze maintained a silence of inhuman and passionate feelings. "Don't move, okay? I'll go back to my car and call someone who can help me. I'll wait with you." The look returned. His desperate fear turned into anger and aggression. His eyebrows sank above his eyes and the corners of his mouth formed a venomous sneer. "My mother is gone. I can't find him." His voice changed. It was as if an animal's voice had risen to his throat, its ferocity taking over his face. I got up again and started walking back towards my car again. I followed all my steps. I almost tripped as I hurried to get to the door, but I kept my eyes on the girl. Kept up my pace. When I felt the cold metal behind me, she was practically sliding towards me. I went back inside and closed the doors. She appeared at the window, her face becoming increasingly harsh as she began pawing at the windows, and shouting her handwriting over and over again. His voice was now closer to that of a monster than to that of a child. I wanted to hurry, but I could only look away from what was happening on the other side of the glass. He sings the words of a frightened child, now coming from a terrible monster. Claw marks can now be seen on the car window. I didn't know how long I would last. Just when the thought of returning home began to seem like the joy it had last felt 24 hours ago, I saw the dimly lit roads light up with gunfire accompanying the sight. The creature turned its head, searching for the source. The gunshots continued as the familiar glow of blue sirens illuminated one side of his disfigured face, and he raced at lightning speed down the street and through the front yards of surrounding homes. He went. I heard the shudder in my heavy breathing and felt the painful beat of my pulse hitting my ribcage. I felt like crying, but I didn't dare do anything but stay hunched over in my questionably secure car. I heard the thud of boots on the tarmac and saw a police officer running in front of my car and stopping not far from it, looking out into the night where the creature had disappeared, hoping to make sure it wouldn't come back. The officer turned and walked toward my torn-out window. He studied the signs while I watched the look of relief and concern on his face. I recognized it as the officer from the night before, and he had this strange look of pain in my presence. He told me to lower the window. I'm sure he wasn't offended by my refusal to do so. He's safe now, my friend. He's not coming back. You deserve to know what just happened. Please open the window and I'll explain everything to you. Sharp, he shouted at the glass. How did you know my last name? The need to cry became stronger than sheer confusion. I listened to the officer and rolled down the shattered window. I could see he was trying to suppress the pain he had such a hard time hiding last night. I'm sorry this happened, man. Take this. He handed me a cardboard folder with some papers inside. Go straight home and read it. I wish I could help you. I saw the tears return to the officer's eyes as he patted the roof of my car and turned back to his patrol car. He hurried in front of me and I sat in silence for a second. I stared at the file for a minute. On the front was a white rectangular sticker with the words "Night Criers" written in bold letters. My curiosity was cut short when I realized I was still on the road with the window open. I shook with nervousness as I waited for the window to return to normal, holding the file in my lap as the wheels screeched as they rolled down the road. I must have exceeded all the speed limits to get home. The tears that gathered behind my eyes did not roll down my cheeks. I felt the file, but every few seconds I checked if it was there. I was startled as I slammed on the brakes in the driveway and ran toward the front door. I sat on my bed and opened the file. Inside there were only 2 pieces of paper. The word "illustrated" is inserted in parentheses at the top of both pages. I started reading. Night criers, extremely aggressive and should not be approached without firearms. Bullets appear ineffective, but loud noises cause great distress and cause people to flee. Do not touch under any circumstances. Night criers appear as startled babies, only appearing in the dark between 12 a.m. and 12 noon m. and 3 a.m. p.m. If touched, the night crier will turn its victim into a night cry regressor. Tests show that, coupled with the desperate need to return to the night cry, the victim will forget his or her previous encounters with the night cry and his body will age by about 2 years, allowing him to inadvertently continue the cycle of age decay. When an adult returns to childhood, they go from being a regressor to a night cry. This is the only time the victim is fully aware of the cycle he or she has been through. The victim's only options after becoming a night screamer are to convince another human to make physical contact with them and pass their cycle, allowing them to return to adulthood or lose their existence in the final stage. Information about the final stage is unknown. Final stage vulnerabilities are unknown. The fate of the final stage is unknown. The life expectancy of the final stage is unknown. End stage treatments are unknown. The next paragraph had a subtitle, It was the name of my hometown. It was used to house both the night criers and the revenants. The population of 95,362 are all revenants. It was converted in 1995 to keep the courses contained and the night criers away from the unaffected public. Since 2005, the only humans who have been a visual return to the youth of family and friends. Telling the reactionary about his cycle is extremely harmful to his mental health and often causes insanity. Being exposed to an end-stage attack appears to reduce the likelihood of such mental hazards. I looked around my room. I noticed there were no family photos and realized I couldn't remember my parents' first names. He couldn't even remember if he had any brothers. The next piece of paper had my last name at the top, but an unknown address. Officer Sharp, current status, returned. My head became light, and my mouth became dry. Officer Sharp made contact with the night crier on February 4, 2015 during a night shift. By the time he moved into his new home, his age had deteriorated to 25 years after he started working shifts at the age of 45. His wife and 2 children reported him missing. He remains in a home with other returnees at the beginning of the cycle. The evolution of the cycle since the transfer is unknown. He had a wife and 2 children. I had a real family somewhere, but I remembered their names and faces less than those of my new fake family. I was angry, confused, sad, and distraught. These things have taken a lot from me. This city isn't boring, it's fake. That thing I saw, roaring outside my window, that was my destiny. My only alternative was to live my life again as a madman, never believed by the outside world, unable to tell those around me without driving them crazy. I sat on my bed all day and night with this file in my hand. I knew what I was going to do. I knew there were lives to be destroyed, but mine would be the price if I continued down the path I was on. That officer knew me. That's why he couldn't look at me, and because of how bad my condition was. I wasn't going to allow myself to become another one of those creatures so that someone else would be intimidated by my current situation. And now I'm sitting in bed as midnight approaches. I want my life back. I can't live here knowing who I am and what I've become. Once the night was long, I would get back into the car of the man I thought was my father and head back into the darkness, continuing the cycle until I had a chance to be myself again. The car keys are ready in my hand. It's a system I've followed thousands of times before. The funny thing is that these pigs are not them, is a phrase that haunts me to this day, and still wakes me up in a cold sweat. Until a couple of years ago, I was a police officer in Texas. I prefer not to give details about my previous whereabouts. And there was a small town about 100 miles from us that we had to take care of, as we sometimes do because of the police. The power was too small for some of their problems. It took me about 2 hours to get there, and it was the city that ended my police career. One day in mid-2012, the department received a call from the small town about some murders they wanted to investigate. This wasn't very strange, but it was sad. They wanted some forensic equipment there with the unexplained evidence surrounding the victims. Another member of the force and I were sent there to investigate and collect evidence in the city. Packed my suitcase and said goodbye to my girlfriend, at the time, who was leaving me for a few days here and there for work reasons. We left around 7 in the morning and arrived at 10:30 because there was a lot of traffic on the road. We went to the police station and then to our separate hotel rooms. It was very rustic and smelly, but we had to use it. When we were 12 years old, we started working on our case and discovered that there had been 3 murders, one of a single woman in her 20s and another of a couple, both in their 40s. Since the department primarily needs forensic evidence, we had to work on both incidents. We ran fingerprints, DNA samples, and extrinsic evidence to see if it was possible that someone was breaking in through an open window. But the only fingerprint results were victims. The DNA samples came back as victims or pets, and there were extrinsic evidence at the scene. In the houses, the only external clues were entry and exit through the couple's back door, and some mud near that door. At first, we thought it was nothing, and we came to the conclusion that he was one of the victims on the day of the murder, since it rained a lot that week. But we still noticed it. We also took his phones to investigate, which we did that night. When I got back to our hotel room, I looked at the girl's phone while my partner looked at the couple's phones. There was nothing unusual about the phone, and it was very similar to my phone in terms of content. There were the weird games, the calendar, the notes, the text messages, Facebook, the camera filters, etc. There is nothing to suspect or worry about. I looked through notes, picture messages, and Facebook feeds and couldn't find anything unusual. I reviewed his location history and noted him for tomorrow's investigation. There was nothing unusual about this, but as a police officer I learned that information can be vital to solving a case. The next day, my partner and I went in different directions to check on everyone's location for the past few days. My list was very short, but it took me a whole day. The most common scenario was his high school job. He worked in administration and sat in an office chair for 6 hours a day and didn't move except to go to the bathroom and when leaving. The news was already public and the school was in mourning. His office had not been touched since the murder. I just went through it and found nothing but work-related documents and some photographs of people I discovered through his colleague, who were friends and family. The next most common place was the grocery store, where I asked to speak to the manager, only to find out that he didn't know her. We tried to check her purchase history, but discovered that she did not have a store membership card. I requested surveillance footage from the days she was there and saved it to a memory card so I could view it later. The next place was the second to last place I was all week, and it was only once over the weekend. It was the local pub that residents didn't use much because most people had family they saw and visited or were exclusive. I went to the bar to investigate, and there I heard the phrase that haunts me to this day. How curious are those whistling pigs, huh? At the bar where I was waiting for the manager, the hoarse voice reached my ears and never left. I looked down and saw a man in his 60s with shaggy gray hair and a mustache. I was watching a documentary about what he calls groundhogs, but he seems to call them whistling pigs. The show looked fun to watch, but I was looking ahead and trying to look somewhat professional. Then he asked me if I was working on the murder. Was still trying to act neutral and professional until the manager came out. He invited me into his office, but I told him it wasn't necessary, and we talked in the quiet bar. He said he knew the woman but didn't notice anything strange, so she headed to her final location in his story. The locksmith was there on Sunday, the day before he was killed. I went to the store, which was not far from the hotel. I looked at the door that had a sign reading 10. I went to the hotel, grabbed something, and put the memory card in my bag for safety. Then I came back. The locked door was locked, but the sign was gone. I entered the musty tent that could only fit up to 5 people at a time. There were shelves full of useless junk along the walls, making it look very strange. I walked over to the desk, rang the bell, and the man with shaggy gray hair came out from behind me. He received me, and I told him how the dead girl had entered his shop just before she was killed. He invited me to the back, which was more spacious and open than the store, and sat me down while he took whatever I had in hand and placed it on the bench. I thought it was weird that I decided he was just being friendly. We talked about the girl and why she had come, but he couldn't remember, which was understandable because he was the only locksmith in town. He went to her records and looked for her purchase receipt, which didn't tell me anything new. I thanked him and left for my hotel. It took me 10 minutes to get back to my hotel, and when I got up to my room I was so tired from traveling all day. I left my papers on the table and went to leave the hotel keys until I realized I had lost one of the spare keys. I wasn't going to tell hotel management at the time. I didn't want to tell them at all. I was just going to do a quick repair myself in the morning at the locksmith. At 9 o'clock in the morning, I went to the locksmith, entered the same dirty room, and rang the doorbell. The same locksmith came out and greeted me like an old friend. I was in a hurry, so I tried to rush it. He took my details, which I thought were unnecessary and, according to him, were for security reasons, which he pointed out were useful yesterday in the murder case. Filled it out and sat while he went in and made a new key. He came out 5 minutes later with a shiny new key and greeted me. The rest of the day consisted of more forensic tests and pages of unnecessary paperwork. After a long day of work, I went to bed at 9 o'clock, which is early for me. Then I woke up feeling a stabbing pain in my left shoulder, and I saw the locksmith above me with his knife dripping with blood. Threw him on the ground when I knocked him down. Kicked him in the chest, grabbed the knife, and threw him across the room. I turned it off and called my coworker who was across the hall and could easily hear me through the thin walls. Now that the man was rushing towards me, I dodged and tried to stop him. I shouted again with no response. Now he had to act like he had no backup. She grabbed the cutting board and hit him in the head, knocking him unconscious. Turned on the lights to see his bleeding head, found the handcuffs in my hands, and put them on him. While I was unconscious, I went to the local station to tell them we were going to get someone. Before he woke up, I walked into my coworker's room and found the door open and a stab wound all over his chest. Drove an ambulance and took the killer to the station. The court case determined that the locksmith was the killer of the 3 victims and was breaking into people's homes using duplicate keys he made when someone came to him. All he had to do was open the door and there was no evidence of him. He had most of the keys and residence location registered at his store, but he only killed 4 people. He killed the woman because she yelled at her grandson at school. He killed the couple for not paying fees on time. And he tried to kill me and my coworker because we could have arrested him. He was imprisoned for 4 years. I've been a small-town cop for 12 years. There's one case that still scares me. Being a cop in a small town in Minnesota probably isn't the most exciting career there is, but it's not bad either. It's actually a relatively peaceful and safe line of work, compared to being in law enforcement in one of the big cities, New York or LA for instance, where the action is. There's only around 10,000 people in the town where I live. It's way out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by miles of open farmland. And the only real crime that ever occurs is pretty minor stuff. The occasional rowdy rednecks getting into a fistfight at one of the 3 bars downtown, teenage vandals, petty theft, the odd drunk driver, case of disorderly conduct here and there, the rare breaking and entering, that sort of thing. The only real serious stuff I've ever had to deal with is a couple cases of domestic violence and assault and battery. But even that's pretty typical, I guess. And it doesn't happen very often. Well, that's not entirely true. There was one case that still haunts me, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Like I was saying, I live in a pretty peaceful little town. Boring, some would even say. The kind of rural, out-of-the-way, hick farming community you've probably driven through on the highway yourself on the way to someplace more interesting, without as much as a second thought or a glance back. The kind of place where nothing out of the ordinary ever happens. You've probably thought, and for the most part you'd be right. But there's one case I can't get out of my mind. One case that still makes my blood run cold whenever I think about it. One case I can't explain no matter how much I try to rationalize it to myself. What happened to the old Garrity woman 7 years ago? Asterisk, 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 asterisk. I'd been a police officer for 5 years when it happened in the early spring of 14. There were only 5 cops on the entire town police force. Me, my partner Jerry, Pete and Vance, who both worked the night patrol, and the police chief, plus Karen, an older woman who was a retired librarian and worked part-time as the dispatcher. The police department was located in the town municipal building and consisted of 2 offices, one for the chief and one for the rest of us to share, and 3 jail cells in the rear. And the 3 of them were never all occupied at the same time. It was an overcast, rainy afternoon in late March/early April. Me and Jerry were in our cruiser on a routine patrol around town when Karen's voice came over the radio telling us there was a possible 10 to 82 in progress at the Garrity house on Turner Road. For those of you who aren't in the know, a 10 to 82 is police code for a burglary. We acknowledged, then changed directions, heading for the Garrity home. I wasn't unduly concerned about the call. Already had a pretty good idea who had made it. Eileen Garrity was an elderly widow who lived in a rundown farmhouse on the outskirts of town. She was probably around 65 or 70 years old and had lived alone since her husband had died of a stroke 3 years before. They had 2 adult children, but they both lived out of town and never visited her. Since her husband's death, she had developed something of a reputation for being eccentric, to put it nicely, or crazy, to put it not so nicely. She was a shut-in who rarely left her home and had her groceries delivered once a week. Basically, a crazy cat lady, minus the cats. The reason she was considered crazy was because she had become pretty flaky and paranoid since being widowed, and had called the police department on multiple occasions for everything from hearing intruders moving around in her attic to seeing UFOs in her cornfield. There were probably at least a dozen others too. All her calls turned out to be false alarms, of course. The burglars she claimed were hiding in her attic turned out to be a pair of raccoons that had slipped in under the roof, and the UFOs were probably just jets flying overhead from the National Guard base 50 miles west. Me and Jerry and Pete and Vance had all visited her home before during our respective shifts. We never got frustrated with her or gave her a hard time about it, and usually indulged her, inspecting her house and property to calm her nerves. She'd relax, thank us, we'd leave, and the process would repeat itself in a couple weeks or a couple months. Honestly, our infrequent trips to her house were probably the only real highlight of what was a rather dull and unexciting job. When we told the chief about Mrs. Garrity's latest emergency, Bigfoot was sneaking around her yard, or there was a giant anaconda lurking in the basement, he would just shake his head sadly. When Vance and Pete were the ones who had to deal with her, they'd tell us all about her most recent ordeal. When me and Jerry saw them at the end of their shifts, and the start of ours, they'd usually smirk in a mean-spirited way, and Pete would twirl his finger next to his temple before they left. Jerry and I just felt sorry for the old woman. It couldn't have been easy for her, a frail, nervous, lonely woman living all alone in that old crumbling house with no friends or close family. I suspected she might be getting senile, or maybe entering the early stages of Alzheimer's or dementia. We worried about her living there by herself, almost a mile from the nearest neighbor. If her health suddenly turned bad or she had an accident and couldn't call for help, well, there wasn't really much we could do about it. Couple times I looked up the numbers of her daughter and son and tried calling them about possibly placing her in an assisted living home or a mental health facility. But the one time I managed to reach her son, as I was explaining his mother's situation to him, he interrupted me, telling me he was too busy at the moment and would call me back, then abruptly ended the call. He never did call me back. From then on, they always happened to be unavailable and never answered any of the voicemail messages I left them. So Jerry and me turned onto Turner Road and drove up to Mrs. Garrity's house on the gray, rainy late spring day, certain that the old woman was just overreacting yet again to something relatively minor, and her imagination was playing tricks on her. She was waiting for us outside on her porch when we pulled to a stop. I'll never forget how she looked. It shocked me. She'd already been a thin, frail woman the other times we had been out there, but we hadn't seen her in probably a couple months, since her last false emergency, and she had changed drastically since then. Now, she was gaunt, almost emaciated, her cheeks hollow and dark rings around her bloodshot, sunken eyes. Her gray hair was tangled and didn't look like it had been washed in days, maybe weeks, and the dress she was wearing was wrinkled and dirty. Her physical appearance was alarming enough, but there was also something about the way she was staring at both of us with those dark, dull eyes that seemed to look at us, through us, and past us all at once. It reminded me of old photos I had seen of American soldiers in Vietnam. The blank, expressionless, shell-shocked look of someone who had been through more horror than any ordinary person should have to endure. Me and Jerry exchanged a shocked look, then got out and approached the old woman. "What seems to be the trouble, Mrs. Garrity?" Jerry asked her amiably, trying to keep his voice nonchalant. "There's something in my house," she told us in a flat, toneless voice. She was shaking slightly, a woman on the verge of total physical and mental exhaustion. The way she phrased it, "not someone but something," made me raise my eyebrow. "Well, you just wait here and we'll go have a look and make sure it's safe," I told her, trying not to sound too patronizing. I looked to Jerry and nodded. We drew our pistols and stepped past Mrs. Garrity, cautiously entering the house. We did a routine sweep of the first floor, guns leveled, then headed upstairs. It only took about 5 minutes to check out the house. We had done it so many times before we had the layout down pat, and there was no sign of any intruders or evidence of a breaking and entering. But I saw plenty of other things that disturbed me deeply. For one thing, the place was a total mess. The house was already pretty decrepit, but Mrs. Garrity had still taken pride at how clean she kept it, and it had always been spick and span on our earlier visits. Now, dirty dishes were stacked high in the kitchen sink. The counters were dirty, and trash and dirty laundry littered the floors. I also noticed that Mrs. Garrity's pillow and blankets were lying rumpled on the couch in the living room. The surface of the coffee table in front of it was cluttered with half-drunk cups of coffee, open containers of food, a Bible and a rosary. It looked like she'd been eating and sleeping in the living room for some time. When we went upstairs, sure enough, the bed in Mrs. Garrity's room was bare, and the room itself looked like it had been vacant for quite a while. There was also something in the living room that really alarmed me. Leaning in one corner was an old double-barreled shotgun that had probably belonged to her late husband. Jerry picked it up, broke it open, and found 2 spent shells in the chamber. He took one out, sniffed it, then told me the gun had been fired very recently. We also discovered something else bizarre. All the mirrors in Mrs. Garrity's house had been shattered, and every closet door had been boarded shut. The one in the front hall on the first floor had a huge hole blasted in the center of it, smaller holes pitting the splintered wood around it. You didn't need to be Sherlock Holmes to deduce that Mrs. Garrity had fired her husband's shotgun into that door. But why? What had happened here? Jerry shot me a perplexed, questioning look. I shrugged, clueless and equally bewildered. Finished with our inspection of the house, we put away our pistols and turned around to go back outside. Mrs. Garrity was standing in the room behind us, staring us at with that unnerving, blank expression. Both of us almost jumped a foot in the air, startled. Neither of us had heard her enter. Jerry regained his composure and flashed her a fake, reassuring smile. "We don't see any sign of him, Mrs. Garrity. He must have slipped out the back. You're safe now." She didn't relax or appear relieved like she had the countless other times we had humored her. Her face seemed to twitch and some new look dawned in her eyes. It took me a moment to identify it. It was a look of pure, hopeless doom mixed with utter terror. "No," she said in that same odd, listless, flat voice. "I'm not safe. It's still here. It's hiding. That's why you couldn't find it. And after you leave, it'll come back for me." Then, She began to quiver. She started to cry with total despair, breaking down into hysterical sobs that racked her whole body. Jerry and me looked at each other, concerned. We went to the old woman and comforted her as best as we could, guiding her over to her couch and sitting her down with us on either side of her, coaxing her gently back to a state of calm. After she had herself back under control, we asked her to explain what had happened. She was quiet for a few moments, gathering her thoughts. Then she began to speak. As we listened to her story, my body temperature seemed to gradually drop, and I felt a chill envelope me. Several times I made eye contact with Jerry, and his expression was a mirror of my own. Disbelief and fear. It started about a month ago, she began. That's when I first heard the scratching at my closet door. Soft, slow, steady scratching that seemed to come from inside her bedroom closet at night. At first she had assumed it was probably a mouse or some other small animal. Except the scratching seemed to come from too high up to be the work of a mouse. Whenever she opened the closet door, always after the scratching had ceased, there had been nothing there. Several times she had started to open the closet door was the scratching was in progress to get to the bottom of it once and for all. But each time she had grasped the knob, she had been overwhelmed with a sudden, overwhelming, irrational sense of unease, and had been unable to do it. The scratching sounded too deliberate, too gently, too deceptively harmless. As if something was trying to lure her into opening the closet door. To be safe, she had started locking her closet door at night. Over the next several days, the scratching had gotten louder and more intense, as if something was trying to tunnel its way through the wood. One day, she opened her closet door and found claw marks on the other side. Claw marks that were 6 feet off the ground. Claw marks that looked like they had been made by fingernails. The horror had really started for Mrs. Garrity about a week after she had first heard the scratching sounds. One night she had awoken to a voice softly calling for her. Voice that seemed to be coming from the locked closet door. She was bewildered, even more so because she recognized that voice. It belonged to Bill, her dead husband. Bill's voice had pleaded for her to open the closet door, telling her that God had sent him down to take her up to heaven, where they could be together again, and young, like they had used to be, forever. At this point, Jerry had looked at me, wide-eyed, from the other side of the couch. Then what happened? I prodded her gently. Thought I was dreaming, Mrs. Garrity said. Thought it had to be a dream. Poor Bill had been gone for 3 years, and since I was having a dream, I didn't see no harm in doing what he was asking me to. I got out of bed and went to the closet. Reached for the lock. Bill, or whoever or whatever was using his voice, had continued to beg her to unlock the closet. When she had refused, the voice had changed, becoming harsh and belligerent. It had angrily demanded she open the door, and when she had still refused, it had begun to shout at her, using profanity and making obscene threats, things Bill never would have said to me while he was alive, before beginning to pound violently on the door. The voice had begun to change, no longer sounding like her late husband's. It had become deeper and distorted, until it didn't sound human. In terror, she had fled her bedroom and spent the night on the couch downstairs. Eventually, the pounding and the threats had stopped. Mrs. Garrity, Jerry politely interrupted her at this point. Why didn't you call us at the police station when this happened? She was silent for a moment. Then a small, bitter smile formed on her lips. I thought you'd think I was just imagining it, she told us. I know people in town think I'm a crazy old lady, and I've had you all out here so many times before for things that turned out to be nothing. I thought maybe it was all in my head, and I didn't want to bother you about it. Things had escalated pretty quickly from there. The pounding and threats had continued every night. She had been too scared to sleep in her bedroom and had started sleeping on the living room couch. Then one night the pounding had begun, not just on her bedroom closet door, but all the closet doors in the house, all at the same time. Like there were people in all of them trying to get out all at once, she told us, but it was the same voice in every closet. The same horrible voice. In fear, she had nailed all the closet doors shut to keep the thing, whatever it was, from coming out to get her. Then, about 2 weeks ago, something even more terrifying had happened. She had been in her bathroom and was washing her hands in the sink when she had looked up into the medicine cabinet mirror. Here she paused. "What did you see?" Jerry asked her. "I saw it," she said in a choked whimper. "I saw its face instead of my own. It was wearing a black robe with a hood, and its face was just a grinning skull. A skull with horns. Its eyes were red, the eyes of the devil himself. I don't mean I saw it standing behind me in the mirror. It was in the mirror itself. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. It reached out of the mirror. It didn't have hands. It had claws, and tried to grab me. In horror, she had thrown a bottle of lotion at the mirror, shattering the glass. Then, to be safe, had done the same to all the other mirrors in the house. How could you stay in this house with all of that happening to you?" Asked her. She shrugged sadly. "I don't have anywhere else to go, and no one who'll take me in. The nights were awful, but it was always better during the days. At least then I could get some sleep. It always stopped by morning, and never happened during the day." She suddenly shuddered. "Until 3 days ago. Then it started happening all the time, day and night. I wasn't safe no matter what time it was. It had all come to a head late this morning. The pounding had gradually gotten more violent and forceful, until all the closet doors were rattling in their frames. Mrs. Garrity knew that even with the boards nailed over them, it was only a matter of time until that thing broke through. In desperation, she had begun praying and reading from the Bible, which had only caused the entity in the closet to laugh at her mockingly. Finally, she had gotten out Bill's shotgun and fired it through the closet door. For a minute or so, there wasn't a sound, she told us. I started to think it was finally over. Then, I saw those red eyes burning in the dark, in the hole the shotgun had made. It chuckled and it said one word to me. What word did it say? Asked her. Tonight, she said, and began to tremble. She lowered her head into her hands and began to sob again. Jerry and I were silent for some time, trying to absorb what she had just told us. We looked at each other, deeply troubled by her story. Neither of us actually believed it, of course, but it was obvious the poor woman was deeply disturbed. She was having some kind of nervous breakdown. Maybe her frayed grip on reality had finally snapped, or maybe old age was taking its toll on her mind. One thing was clear, it wasn't safe for her to be alone anymore. Especially not here. It was not healthy for her. Hell, for all we knew, maybe her paranoid delusions were the result of some dangerous form of mold that had formed in the house. Jerry and excused ourselves for a moment, then stepped outside to talk in private. We both agreed she needed help. She needed to be institutionalized. But for now, it was best she stay somewhere else. I had an incident that happened about a year ago that scared the shit out of me. For privacy reasons, the most I can tell you is that it happened in Indiana. This is a legit story. I'm not going to tell you that Bigfoot ran out of the woods and punched out one of my windows. I didn't box an evil leprechaun from another dimension to save my captured girlfriend. I just saw something that really freaked me out, and I feel like I have to share this. Before I tell you about the incident, I need to explain why my best friend's grandparents' neighborhood has always spooked me. I'll call my buddy Steve. Steve's grandparents lived about 25 minutes out of town. There are probably about 10 houses in the area. Each house is surrounded by ominous-looking trees. The jagged branches stick out like they are hands reaching out for you. It's kind of a swampy area with very little lighting around. The lack of lighting makes everything invisible in the woods surrounding the houses. It is literally straight out of a horror movie. This would be enough to scare some people, but there have also been some disturbing occurrences. A while ago, there was a man that was tied to a chair in an abandoned house, and someone set the house on fire. I was skeptical when Steve told me about it, but even his grandparents told me the same thing. One day, while driving to his grandparents' house, he showed me the burned remains of the house. As if that didn't give off enough bad vibes, a lady hung herself in her front yard after sending her kids to school one day. It's just a downright creepy/sketchy place to drive to at night. Steve had been staying at his grandma's house for about a week because his grandparents were visiting relatives in Arkansas. This provided the perfect chance to drink and basically do what we want. Now that you basically got the backstory, I'll get to what happened. Well, one night Steve texts me and asks if I wanted to come over and hang out. It was late November and a little after 10:30. It was late, but I'm a bit of a night owl, so I didn't mind. I told him to give me a few minutes and I'd head over. Assuming that he is still at his grandma's, I start heading that way. I drive all the way to his grandma's house and realize all of the lights inside the house were off. Confused, I whip out my phone and text Steve. Me. Hey, you are at your grandma's, right? Steve. Nope, my house. Me. If I just drove all the way out here, you could have told me. Steve. Sorry, man. Just hurry up and get over here. I got something I gotta tell ya. Steve had been trying to get with a girl he had liked for a long time. He's really bad with talking with the ladies though, so he'd been asking me for advice. That had to be what this was all about. I chuckled while shaking my head, put my car in reverse and called Steve a dumbass under my breath. I began to head back and then my phone rang. It was Steve. I answered it, and he began to give me some details about the girl's situation. I stopped at a four-way stop and listened to Steve ramble on and on. I sat there for some time listening to Steve get all pumped up about his recent success. I looked up to finally turn left and saw something. It appeared to be a shadow in the front yard of an old house. I had no clue someone even lived in the house. The shadow was very close to the road. Oh shit, some guy is standing in his front yard looking at me. I laughed. He's probably wondering why the hell I'm just sitting here at the stop sign. My car radio showed that I had been stopped at the stop sign for about 5 minutes, so I could imagine I seemed sketchy. I began to turn my car left. My headlights illuminated the shadow, and I became very serious. My headlights revealed an old lady standing there with her hands folded as if she was praying. She was looking down, and her mouth was moving quick. Couldn't make out anything she was saying at all. Her mouth was just moving 100 miles an hour and she seemed like she was in a trance. She was probably 5 feet from my car. I sat there and stared. It was probably 10 degrees outside, and all that she was wearing was a gray dress. My headlights were directly on her, and she didn't even look up. I didn't know what to do exactly. At first I was concerned for the old lady, but the more she stood there, the more the hairs stood on the back of my neck. Steve realized I hadn't said anything for a few minutes. Steve, you still there? Me. Dude, this old lady is just standing here. Steve, what is she doing? Me. She's just praying. Right by the road. Steve, what the hell? It's almost midnight. Is she okay? Me. I think. I don't know. I really don't want to ask. She looks almost possessed the way she's standing there. I'm afraid if I drive, though, she might run in front of my car. She's not even looking at me. She's just wearing this dress out here too. Think I'm just going to try to slowly drive past her. She's almost on the road where I have to turn though. Slowly start to attempt to go by her. I hit my brakes, slightly afraid that she'd run out in front of me. As I slowly start driving by, she is literally inches from my passenger window. She didn't budge. Her mouth never quit going either, never even acknowledged me. I still couldn't hear what she was muttering, but I didn't want to roll my window down to find out. Steve spoke into the phone, and he seemed worried. "Steve, wait," turning. "Where are you?" "Me? I'm at the four-way stop right by your grandma." "Steve, dude, that lady hung herself there. Get out of there." My stomach sank, and I smashed the gas pedal. I drove about 80 till I got close till town. I was so scared that my voice became shaky on the phone. When I arrived at Steve's, I told him everything I saw. We were both in disbelief. Suddenly, I became very nervous. Every scary movie you ever see usually involves the demon or ghost following the person to their home. I stayed at Steve's house for 2 nights and nothing happened. I began to dread going to sleep at my house, but when I finally did, everything still was normal as usual. There was one occurrence when Steve had to grab something at his grandma's, so I rode with him. On the way back, it looked like there was a lady walking around in a dress, but Steve took no chances and blew past the stop sign, so we really couldn't tell. As of now, there is nothing more to add to the story, whether it was the lady's ghost, demon, or just some really weird old lady that decided to pray by the road at midnight in 10-degree weather. It scared the shit out of me. Hopefully it was the last one. Now I take a different way to Steve's grandma's if I go there at night. Just remember, if you guys somehow stumble upon the same neighborhood, don't stop for the old lady. Don't stop driving late at night. It all started late last night. About once a month I visit my parents for the weekend, who live about 4 hours away from me. It is a quiet, peaceful drive through remote rural roads, so I don't mind how often I drive them. Last night the drive was like many others, with the only exception being that I left later than usual. It was dark for the majority of the drive, and I didn't return home until almost midnight. That being said, it was a nice drive, although I could see lightning flashing in the distance from a far-off storm that I seemed to be following. About 2 hours in, on the most remote section, thought I saw something in the distance. I am always afraid of deer or moose, so I tend to slow right down at the slightest sign of life. As I approached, I was shocked to see what appeared to be a person lying on the side of the road. I slammed the car to a stop and ran out to see if they were all right. As I drew close, I could clearly see it was a girl, who appeared to be in her 20s, with dark black hair and torn, muddy clothing. I called out to her, "Are you okay?" There was no answer or sign of movement. I quickly crouched down and put my fingers to her neck as I had seen on TV, trying to check for some signs of vitals. Nothing. Grabbed her wrists, trying for a different pulse, and was shocked at how cold her skin felt. With a sinking feeling, I knew I was too late. Her face was turned away at an odd angle, and so I gently reached out and turned it towards me, and knew for sure she was gone as soon as I saw her eyes. They stared back at me, unblinking. For a moment it appeared as though a flash of sentience still shone in them, but it quickly faded, leaving dull, glassy eyes staring at me through the darkness. Reached for my phone, ready to dial 911. I briefly hesitated. Do I still call 911 when the person is already dead? Do I call the local police phone number instead? Technically, it's not an emergency anymore. Shaking my head at myself, I dialed 911. Police, fire, or ambulance? The reassuring voice said on the other end. Police or ambulance? I'm not sure. What is the emergency? She inquired. Well, I was out driving, and there is a girl at the side of the road, but I think she's already dead. She has no pulse, her skin is cold, and she is unresponsive. I spoke quickly, almost stumbling over my words as I was understandably feeling a little unnerved. I quickly gave the operator my location and pertinent details. Police and ambulance are on their way. "Are there any signs of injury on her?" the woman asked. "Quickly checked. No, she is only muddy, and her clothing is torn," I replied. It took me aback, as I hadn't realized until that moment how strange it was that a girl should be out here in the middle of nowhere, dead with no signs of injury. As I looked around at the darkness, I began to feel nervous, and decided to wait in my car, still speaking with the operator. The police showed up fairly quickly, and the officers asked me a few short questions before I was allowed to continue on my journey. As I continued driving, I tried to shake off the events of the night, but as I was driving through darkness with no means to distract myself, I understandably found it hard to forget. I finally arrived home, ready to go straight to bed. A little embarrassed, I left the hallway light on outside my door. It may seem silly, but it was my first experience even seeing a dead body, and I was feeling a little creeped out. Normally my roommates would help me feel secure, but both were gone at the moment, and the apartment felt strange and empty without them. I fell asleep fairly quickly, but suddenly woke up around 2:30 a.m. It took me a second to realize why everything felt wrong. The hallway light, which I had purposefully left on to shine some light in the room, was out. As I realized this, I felt a chill take over my body as I lay in the darkness, waiting for my eyes to adjust. Slowly, I began to see shapes in the darkness, and reassured myself that everything was ok. I saw my desk take shape, and my dresser, my yoga mat rolled into a ball, gave me a fright, until I realized what it was. However, I slowly came to realize that there was one shape I couldn't place. In the middle of the room was a dark, humped shape, taking up the center of the floor. I racked my brain as my body froze in fear and my heart pounded, trying to think what it was I could have left there. It was only as I saw two glimmers in it that I realized it was exactly the shape of the girl last night, in the curled up position she had been left in on the side of the road, and the glimmers were exactly where her eyes would have been. I was driving home one night after meeting some friends for some late-night Waffle House the week after the spring break of my freshman year in college at the state university I lived near. Mike and his brother Ben had gone to school out of state, and their spring break was that week, so we were hanging out around my work and class schedule while they came home for their break. Alex had stayed local as well, and was going to community college nearby before transferring to the university I was going to. Mike and Ben had just gotten back home after their 3-hour drive, and we all met at the restaurant around 10 that night. We talked and had fun after not seeing each other for a while. It was nice to catch up with them after not seeing them for a few months. I was living at home and commuting, so my mother called me around 1:45 and told me I should head home because my father had worked the next day and didn't want to be woken up by me coming home at some ungodly hour of the morning. We all got up, paid for our meals and coffee, and left. We talked as we walked out to our cars and went our separate ways just as we always did, and I started on my way home. I took a slightly longer route home because I didn't do much night driving, and I was still a bit of a new driver, so doing things like actually getting to use my brights were still amusing. When I got to a wooded section of the road home, I was surprised to realize how dark it was. I had been driving with street lights up to that point, but there weren't any there, and with the night being new moon, everything but the road in front of me and my dashboard was pitch black. I had my windows down for the short time I had been driving, and was surprised at how cold it had gotten because it had been rather warm out when I had left the restaurant. But North Carolina weather never makes sense, as every resident of the state knows. I had just rolled my windows up when I got to the turn in the road. I was passing through it when I saw something brown immediately ahead of me, so I slammed on my brakes and stopped just short of what looked like an animal that had just been hit by another car. In the short glimpse I had gotten, it looked like a deer laying on its side with its legs splayed haphazardly, and some dark patches of blood in its fur. I was just reaching for my door handle to get out and see what it was when the thing stood up in front of me and ran into the woods. But before it ran, it looked into my car and locked eyes with me. You know how they say deer have dead eyes? That they've just got cold, expressionless faces. I had seen that before, and this was different. I swear this thing was staring into my soul in the most gut-wrenchingly horrifying way possible. It looked like it had been hit by multiple cars with how grossly injured it seemed, but as it stood up it was gone with its horrible, jerking gait that reminded me of Gollum from the Lord of the Rings series. I sat for a few moments with a feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach, but I knew I wasn't getting out of my car to follow that thing, so I started driving again. The road was still dark for a few miles, and I thought I saw a shape in my rear-view mirror a few times, but I told myself I was just seeing things because I had been pretty scared by that creature that I was slowly convincing myself was just a maimed deer. I reached a stoplight that had long been empty for the evening, but I took the time to search through the local radio stations to find some music to listen to. I was in the middle of a large static eye gap between stations when my whole car was rocked by something hitting it from behind. My head spun around and my body went numb as I saw the creature slam into my rear window, slide over my roof, and land in front of me. I stared. I couldn't make my body do anything. I don't even think I breathed as I watched that thing for what had to have been only a few seconds as it slowly stood up and locked eyes with me. Its brown fur was matted with blood. Some of the flesh on its rib cage had been torn away to the bone. Its legs all bent at awkward angles, and it still had those soul-sucking, dead eyes. It took a step towards the car, and every atom in my body screamed, "Run!" with all the force they could muster. No longer acknowledged that the light was still red as I floored my gas pedal, swerving around the thing and seeing it still stare at me as I sped away. I was going faster than I ever thought my 2000 Impala could go as I swerved around country road corners and tore past the entrances to driveways. I have no idea just how fast I was going because every part of my body was still screaming at me to get as far away from that thing as I could. Eventually reached an area with street lights, and I saw it following me from about 200 feet behind. I was hysterical. I had no idea what that monster was, but knew in my bones that if I stopped it would kill me. So I kept speeding down the road and frantically called my parents because I had no idea what to do. My mother was the first one to answer my calls. She tells me that call was one of the most horrible things she's ever heard. I screamed into the phone, "Mom, this thing is chasing me. I don't know what to do. It's horrible. It wants to kill me. It's keeping up with the car. Wake up, Dad. Tell him to get one of the guns because I don't know what I'm doing. And it wants to get me. Please, Mom, help." And at that point, the call ended with the first ear-splitting scream that the thing made. I dropped my phone out of surprise, and the call ended. I wasn't navigating home with my conscious thoughts because they were being dominated by an overwhelming feeling of sheer terror. It screeched again with its guttural, nails-on-a-chalkboard shriek that I still hear sometimes as I'm dozing off to sleep. It seemed like an eternity of flying down the road with radio static blaring over my speakers and the screams of the thing following behind me. I made it home after that hellish eternity behind the wheel and squealed to a halt in my driveway with the bumper of my car ending up 6 inches into our front bushes. Jumped out of the car and left the driver's door open as I sprinted into the house and nearly dove through the front door. I was just beginning to scream for my father to shut the door when the police arrived. My parents couldn't give the police any more information than me saying something was trying to kill me, so they dispatched quite a few squad cars to the house. The mass of flashing red and blue lights and small army of police officers in front of my house didn't help, but they managed to calm me down, get my statement, photograph the car, and say that there didn't seem to be any immediate threat to my safety anymore, so they left for the evening. That was it. I laid in bed that night staring at my ceiling, expecting that thing to come crashing through my bedroom window at any moment and gore me with its antlers or beat me with its shattered legs. But it didn't. and the next few days went by with no incidents and me making a point to only drive during daylight hours. The police said I must have hit someone that night, because the damage to my car was consistent with me hitting something, not being hit from behind. They found a body on that turn that they say was a drunk that must have stumbled out into the road in front of me as I drove by. My therapist says it was all some form of coping mechanism, because I can't handle the guilt of knowing that I killed someone, that it's all in my head is some way to cover up what truly happened because I'm suppressing the memory. But I know what I saw, and I know what I still see every time I drive at night. If you enjoyed today's stories, leave a comment below. It'll help me a ton. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.